Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name's Andy Oakley, and this presentation, The Great New Zealand Economic Collapse, is brought to you by the One New Zealand Party. Despite what might be good practice, the neoclassical economists in the universities are teaching the students the entirely wrong way to look at the economy. And so this presentation is designed to show that not only are the universities teaching incorrectly, the politicians are listening to them, and they are running a system that is resulting in a slow economic collapse, which we'll see throughout this presentation. So to understand what's going wrong with our economy and who's doing it, I've put a couple of things on the screen there that are clues to what's going wrong. So no matter which government's in for the last 40 or 50 years, Labour or National, they each believe that running the government or the New Zealand economy is the same as running a household. That is, they look to balance the books. And you can see that John Key says that on the screen there, also Bill English. And we can see that the Labour Party are trying very hard to look good running a surplus. So not only are they not only are they balancing the books, they're saving money besides. And you can see the government reports there say that the government books remain in a healthy state because they have a $5.5 billion surplus. Now I want you to remember this slide all the way through the presentation, because as we get through, you're going to realise what they're doing is absolutely wrong. So the governments get their advice from Treasury and all sorts of economic advice, and over the years the advice they've had is that you need to run a government being fiscally responsible. So much so that they set up the Public Finance Act 1989, and they put sections in there about fiscal responsibility. So in this legislation, or in this section of it, they're talking about the principles of responsible fiscal management. They state that the government must pursue its policy objectives in accordance with the following principles, the principles of responsible fiscal management. Right, so if you're not following this, you're going to cop it from somebody for not acting fiscally responsible, and nobody would want to do that, would they? So Section A says reducing total debt to prudent levels so as to provide a buffer against factors that may impact adversely on the level of total debt in the future by ensuring that until those levels have been achieved, total operating expenses in each financial year are less than the operating revenues in the same financial year. So they're telling you that you can't spend more than you earn. That is what they take in tax. And B says once prudent levels of total debt have been achieved, maintaining those levels by ensuring that on average over a reasonable period of time, total operating expenses do not exceed total operating revenues. So in that, they have got revenue coming from tax, GST, petrol tax, whatever, road taxes. They've got taxes coming in from everywhere. They also, in here, allow for the government to borrow, what they call borrowing anyway. And they limit that to about 20% of GDP, which we'll see in a few slides. So they're limited money. This is a limited money supply system. It's limited to how much that they can tax off people and businesses and how much they will allow themselves to borrow. So in terms of behaving fiscally responsible, the political parties get their cues from Treasury. And in this slide here, we see that Treasury are giving advice to whether it's Labour or National. I think it's the same advice they give to both. So the PRFU here are explaining that they are forecasting that debt levels need to be dropping over a period of years. This was before the last election. and you can see that they are wanting the percentage of GDP, the debt to percentage of GDP, to track down from 22, and they're wanting it to be below 20%. Obviously, in the future, Treasury want no debt. You'll see why that's a bad idea in a few slides. But anyway, Labour policy was this, that they would start at 23 and slowly track down to 20% in the year 21-22. Whether they actually get there or not, I'm not sure. I don't think they're going to be anywhere near it, but never mind. And here is the graph showing those figures. So what I've done here is I have tried to build a graphic model of how the current limited money supply system works. Now, bear in mind that this limited money supply system that the government run is a theory. It's a theory by the neoclassical economists of how to run an economy, and basically it works like this. And we'll start from the point where a budget is going to be delivered. The first thing the Minister of Finance does when he's going to deliver a budget is he doesn't look, this is some clues to why these systems don't work, he doesn't think about or look what the country needs. The first thing he does is he goes to Treasury and get a forecast for how much tax revenue the government will get through wage and salary tax, business or corporate tax, petrol tax, excise tax, all sorts of taxes, GST, etc. And these figures are not far off actual. So Treasury come back and tell him that he's going to get $80 billion. The next thing the government do is they sit down and look at, okay, so what does our country need? And when they look at the health system, the education system, infrastructure, the social welfare system, the first thing they realise is, holy moly, $80 billion is nowhere near enough. And so they look to their next source of revenue. And as I said, the next source of revenue is what they call borrowing, or the issuing of interest-attracting bonds. So as I said, if the GDP is going to be, let's say, pick a number, it's 100 billion, well, they limit themselves to borrowing 20% of that. So let's say they get $20 billion, they sell the bonds to whoever. I've got it coming out of China here, but it could be any wealthy nation, people. In fact, anything from 50% to 80% of these bonds is owned by people outside the country. So their money goes into the Reserve Bank, into here, and now the government say they've got $100 billion to spend. And by the way, $100 billion is nowhere near enough either. At least it's a bit better than 20 billion. So they put that money into the economy, into this container here, as represented by a container, and they generate circulating currency, industry, commerce, public or private saving. This is all the fluid in the container. But they haven't put anywhere near enough money in. There is idle workforce, there's unused resources, there's potential commerce still to happen, but it's not going to, because they cannot find enough way to get enough tax revenue. If they try to put tax up too much more, well, you know, the whole thing comes tumbling down. At some point, people are getting taxed too much and businesses are getting taxed too much, and they're likely to lose the next election as the opposition say, well, tax levels will be lower with us, and so it goes backwards and forwards. There's some other things to mention about this model. As we see the also coming out of the economy here is the tax, the interest being paid that way. So essentially what happens is the $20 billion goes into our bank, into the Reserve Bank, and at some point when the bond life is up, the $20 billion goes back. So that's a net zero transaction, 20 in, 20 out. And the government have also paid out the interest. So in terms of a money-making scheme, it's about as bad as it gets. Another point to mention is this figure here. That is the difference between how much the government spend in and how much they tax out. This is known as the deficit. And governments don't like deficits. They want small deficits, not big deficits. So they're trying to balance the books, trying to get that number down to zero. In fact, as we can see that both Labour and National over the years have tried to run surpluses, thinking that that's a good idea. So there's nothing really positive about this system. There doesn't seem to be enough. There doesn't seem to be a way to get enough money here. They've limited themselves here, and so there just doesn't seem to be a way to get ahead with this system that they run. Actually, what happens is the economy slows, growth slows, the money leaves the citizens, and we'll see that in a little bit, and ends up in the government's Reserve Bank. To recap then, clearly all of the main political parties, the coalition partners and Treasury believe that running New Zealand's economy is like running a household budget, i.e. running deficits is unsustainable. And this is easy for us to understand. The neoclassical economists, and so our education system, also believe that running a country's economy is like running a household budget. Again, running deficits is unsustainable. Their belief that they are correct is so strong that they have enacted legislation, the Public Finance Act, that forces that belief. And if anybody should come along, as I'm doing now and have others have before, and say that you're doing this wrong, they won't believe it. In the picture there is Professor Bill Mitchell. He attended a lecture at Victoria University in 2017. He's one of a number of progressive economists all around the world who are trying to tell governments that they've got this wrong. He stood before them for an hour explaining how they were wrong, showing them models of what they were doing was wrong, and they ignored him. And so this is the groupthink that I'm talking about that goes on in universities and people with degrees and PhDs. Their whole careers depend on things not changing. And if you think about the economy versus and compare it with, say, engineering, why would engineering come along such a long way in universities and the economy hasn't shifted an inch? They're still teaching exactly the same things today as they were 30, 40 years ago. It gives you a clue to what's really going on. Let's face it, nearly everyone, including you, believe that the government running deficits is unsustainable. And that's because for a household to run deficits, it is unsustainable. We recognise that. Spending more than you earn is bad and an easy concept to politicise. And they do, backwards and forwards. So inept and corrupt politicians do politicise this. After every election, you'll see, as some of those hoardings did, we'll balance the books sooner. They were fiscally irresponsible. Backwards and forwards it goes. And all the while, our economy is being drained, growth slowing, everything sort of turning to custard. And we all fall for it. So what happens when a government run this limited money supply system and stick rigidly to not borrowing much, limiting it to 20% of GDP? limiting the tax take. Everything becomes a conversation about the cost. Everyone focuses on the deficit, or the difference between what the government spend and what they get in revenue. So growth slows, there's less tax revenues, taxes go up, and it all starts imploding. And if you think about it, if you think about what goes on in the media, and I'm talking about the newspapers, television, what is important to you as a family, really our lives are wrapped up with the allocation of limited funds through governments. We sort of agree when they say we haven't budgeted for this, or we don't have enough money for that. We just go along with them, and we let them off because they must be right, of course. It wouldn't be in government otherwise. On the screen now is a graph showing the New Zealand household debt to GDP ratio. And this is a measure of what happens when a government is not spending into the economy. They limit themselves, limit the revenue they get, and limit the borrowing they can do, and so limit what goes into the economy. Basically, people and businesses run out of money. And you can see the debt levels there are up at 93, 94%. These are some of the highest in the world. I think only 4 countries in the world have higher private debt rates than this. It's also an indicator of moving closer to financial collapse, when suddenly, or not suddenly, over a period of time, that people just run out of funds to contribute to the economy and the whole thing grinds to a halt, which appears to be what's happening here. If we look at a chart of, I'm just grabbing a pen here. If we look at the chart on the screen, per capita GDP, it's a measure of how productive we were or are, and it really tells us something. So what we're doing here is we're measuring or comparing the US, Australia and New Zealand in terms of how productive we are, measured in international dollars. Don't worry about getting confused about that. It's just numbers that we compare as the percentages that we're interested in. And if we look in 1840, where New Zealand had just come out of into tribal warfare, where that really, you know, if anything's going to prevent you from growing, it's into tribal warfare. But we can measure in 1840 the US number there, Australian there, and New Zealand there. So we were 25% of the US and about 30% of Australia. But by the year 1900, so New Zealand had become one nation. All the tribes had agreed to become one nation, have equal rights, single standard of citizenship, and on we went to build the country. 60 years after the signing of the treaty, there's the US's number, there's Australia's number, and there's the New Zealand number. So we had overtaken the US and Australia in terms of how productive we were as a measure against GDP. Now that's an incredible result, and it shows you what happens when a nation starts pulling together as one. We overtook most other emerging nations in the world, and it didn't stop there. 1950s, we're looking at the period 50s, 60s, and perhaps the first part of the 70s. This was a golden era in New Zealand. I was born into this this generation, if you like, and it really was a golden era, because although US had gone on to become a superpower, and their numbers were now quite big, and there's Australia's and there's ours, so we were still nearly 90% of the US in terms of our productivity, and we'd gone further ahead than Australia. And if you look at other indicators, economic indicators around that time in New Zealand, we had about 1% unemployment for a long time, 70% home ownership, a single wage could support a family of 5 or 6 people, all sorts of measures, both economically and socially. It was a wonderful period for New Zealand. But we see now, since I believe the late 80s, things have turned around and we're really going backwards. Now we are 50% of US, 74% of Australia. Look at how much we've dropped from 114% to 74%, and we're sinking back further with Australia to 73%, and a slight difference with the US. So what this is telling us is when a government spends into the economy, the country becomes productive and the citizens become prosperous. And when the governments try to run surpluses, people lose their wealth. That's basically what that graph is showing. It's also showing us how good things were in the 1950s, 60s. To look at it in another way, we see now a graph with the New Zealand gross core government debt from 1860 to 2000. So if we look at this period here, this is the period when New Zealand was 25% of US and 30% of Australia. And not much government spending going on and not much productivity. But the government starts spending here, spending more and more and more, up to 140 odd percent of GDP. And this was the period here, the 1900s, when we'd overtaken, this period here, when we'd overtaken both the US and Australia in terms of GDP per capita. I think what we're looking at here is the 1930s recession, and the government poured a lot of money into the economy, which got us out of the shtick. Here, we're still up around 150% of GDP. This is when we were further ahead of the Australians and about 90% of the US. And over the years, the governments have been spending less and less, trying to balance the books, trying to run surpluses. And here we have this 20% they're trying to get to. But we're only 50%, 57% of the US in terms of productivity and 74% of the Australians. So the more we spend, the more prosperous the people become, and the less we spend, the less prosperous the people become. Very important statistic, which we'll see a number of different ways in the next few slides. So what we are seeing is totally opposite to what we expect to see. The government's telling us that being fiscally responsible is the way to behave. They've forced themselves into it with legislation and holding each other to account with this fiscal responsibility. But the graphs are showing the different things happening. So something's going on here. And to find out what's going on, we can go to really progressive group of economists all over the world. There's a large group who look at the economy differently, and this is the group that is trying to convince governments to stop doing what they're doing and look at the economy another way. So Stephanie Kelton is very good at explaining these things. She has a series talking about rethinking fiscal policy. And I've borrowed some of her data, which is why I'm mentioning her. In this graph here, we can see in the black the private sector financial balance of the US government balance versus the government budget. The government budget is in red. The red is because the government is in deficit. But what we can see is the clear correlation between when the government spend more money, the people get wealthier. The more money is in the public sector. This happens, if I still got my pen, yes. This happens, so the more they spend, as we're looking at other graphs, here we see the public have a lot of wealth at the same time. Around the 2000s, I can't remember, was it the Clintons? I think it was Clinton said he would run a surplus, and that's what they did. He actually achieved it. But look what happened to the wealth of the people. It dived. It was a shocking result for the public. Looked good in the government's purse because they had a surplus, but the people were really suffering. And they must have learned from that experience. So the government spent a lot of money here. The government spent a lot of money here, and the people got really wealthy here. So Americans are far better off than what we are. Here's another slide showing very similar things, but we also this time bring into the foreign balance in green. But we're seeing the same things, and we're seeing again here what happened when the Clinton government went into surplus. A couple more slides. This one showing home ownership rates for households 1936 to about 2017. And this one mirrors the graph where the government was spending money in the 1930s, 40s and 50s. Home ownership rates reached 70% in the 1950s. And this was done mostly on a single income. So a single income and 1% unemployment. So economically, the country was performing really well. A single take-home wage could support a family of 5 or 6 people, 70% home ownership rates, 1% unemployment. Things were really going well there. And this lasted for quite some time, up until the mid-70s, when there was a slight upturn. Now, I believe that upturn was the result of more women entering the workplace. So now we had the effect of 2 incomes, improving the home ownership rates just for a very short time, for maybe a decade there, I think. Something to remember about this time, there was 8% unemployment, and as I said, it's now a double income. And since that time, everything's tapering off, and we're nearly at 1930s home ownership rates now. So consistently bad economic performance from the mid-80s. The next one down is home ownership rates by age, comparing 2001 and 2013. And that slide's on there to show you that in 2001, the average age of a person buying the house was 35 years old. And by 10 or 11, 12 years later, the average age gone up to 45. And if that keeps trending, obviously you'll be dead before you can afford to buy a house, which is not a good outcome. Looking at New Zealand consumer confidence, unsurprisingly, it's tanking as our economy looks worse and worse, and the people have less and less money. I'd probably add at this stage that a lot of people, middle and upper income areas are fine. They've bought their houses, they've got their wealth, and they're getting by okay. And this is an area where I would say that when people are yelling out "Okay, Boomer," they're a little bit pissed off that for largely Boomers are okay, and they are definitely not. And I would agree with them in that sense. They're not, and we need to do something to fix that. Okay, Human Development Index indicators. This one, GNI per capita, measured in US dollars. So you can see New Zealand is languishing way behind. So our gross national income per capita is way behind Australia, Ireland, way behind the OECD average. It's just a shocking result for us when compared to the rest of the world. I noticed this when I went to UK earlier last year, and saw my family seem to have a lot more in terms of wealth than people in New Zealand, or equivalent people in New Zealand. Unsurprisingly, New Zealand business confidence is tanking along with every other statistic about the economy. So not surprising there. A few figures here that we're looking at that household debt to GDP graph again, but we're now saying today the average take-home wage is about $780 a week. That's take-home. The median rent in Wellington is $540. So immediately you see a massive chasm between wages and rents in Wellington. This person, and the average person, will not be funding a family of 5 or 6 people on that. Be lucky to pay the rent himself and live in a property at that rate. It just can't be done. Median house price in Wellington, $629. There's just no way on earth that anybody with an average wage is going to be able to afford that. So this is a terrible thing, really, that our young have to assign themselves to the fact that they're not going to own houses. And it's not their fault. It's through poor economic management by successive governments, and remember, they're both as bad as each other. It's a terrible thing to be thinking about, that my children, well, my older child is in a house, but he's in his 40s, so but my younger son, not likely at all. More evidence of an out-of-control economy, house prices relative to income and rents. We can see from the mid-90s, things slowly spiraling out of control into 2004, 2006, things drastically out of control. So what we are seeing here is that the legacy that we will be leaving our grandchildren is an out-of-control economy where they are financially worse off than us. And this is a result of voting for political parties who don't understand the economy and getting terrible advice. I think there's no doubt that we need to accept that this isn't working. These people in the on the screen have taken us from a single income high home ownership model in the 1950s and 60s to a double income housing unaffordable crisis by 2020. They're all responsible, and they're both from both sides of the House, Labor and National. They really have stuffed this up big time. And I can't see any other political party apart from us talking about the economy in the correct way. So if the current politicians and economists who are giving them advice, Treasury, etc., don't really know what they're doing, who do we turn to? Who does know what's going on? Well, on the screen here is just one of a number of progressive economists right around the world who have for 20 odd years been trying to explain to various governments that they're doing this wrong. And these people are professors, PhDs, etc., and are really at the top of their field. You might, well, because I'm involved in engineering, and if I compare economics, how economics moves in universities with, say, engineering, we have wonderful advances in engineering, and economics goes nowhere. They're still doing exactly the same thing today as they were 30, 40 years ago. So the people in question here are L. Randall Wray, Stephanie Kelton, Warren Mosler, who's the book there, Soft Currency Economics 2. We are in contact with Warren. He's from the Mosler Foundation, and there on the end is Professor Bill Mitchell, who was the one who came to Victoria University. So these people are part of the progressives, and they're working at a very high level. There's Stephanie Kelton working with Bernie Sanders. Don't get too upset that some economists work with the left and the right. Luckily, this economic system that we're looking at is neither left or right. But that just shows you at the levels that they're working at. She was the economic advisor to Sanders. So these people are progressive and they have new ideas and build economic models to prove their ideas. From learning from these people, watching their lectures, we within the One New Zealand Party have taken some notes of some of the things they're telling us. For instance, the New Zealand government operate a fiat currency. The New Zealand government are the sole issuer of the sovereign New Zealand dollar. And the New Zealand government, in this respect, the New Zealand government is not like a household. Can you imagine a household running a budget when it was the producer of the currency? The New Zealand government is nothing like a household. And the New Zealand government can never be insolvent. These are some of the principles that we learn from these. So I'm just grabbing a pen here. So what I have done is I've spent many months researching the type of economics that these professors teach, and I've tried to alter the model that we saw earlier in the presentation to show how a capacity-driven money system would work, where tax revenue does not fund spending. You can imagine that if you are the sole issuer of the currency, you don't need to stack the Reserve Bank full of taxes from people to spend. You have as much as the money as possible. So how do we set up an economy that works with that principle? Well, first of all, it starts at the fundamental level at the budget, where instead of the finance minister asking Treasury how much money they're going to get in tax revenue, they actually think about what the people want. So the first thoughts are, what do the people need? It's not so much what they want, it's what they need. And a way to describe this would be, if the people decided that what they need is a 6-lane highway from Wellington to Auckland, for instance, what the government does is it looks at the capacity constraints around this, i.e., are there companies in existence, either in New Zealand or overseas, who can do this? And if there are, well, they would simply call for tenders and they would choose the company that best suited them, whether it was they gave New Zealand company advantages, which they possibly would, and if the company was capable and it made sure it paid its staff well, it would simply sign the contract and issue the currency as the project went along. And so what this means is that all the thinking around the budget is nothing to do with the cost, and it's all about capacity. Some things are easier to do. For instance, you can fund healthcare systems much better. You can fund drugs much better. You can fund the pension is no problem to fund. There'll never be any problem funding the pension. So we don't have to scare old people anymore. The whole economic system is really changed and all about capacity. So I've chosen a number 200 billion, which is twice as much as the last one. Now, we don't know what the number would be because it's really about the capacity. So once they've established how much they can spend by looking at the capacity of the economy, the Reserve Bank simply issues the currency. It's new currency. Every time the Reserve Bank issues currency, it's new. Actually, this is how it works already. It's just that they've set up a system that makes it look like it's different. They're putting digits into the Reserve Bank, taking digits off you in terms of tax, putting digits on their spreadsheet in the Reserve Bank, and now they think they can have the money to spend. It's all smoke and mirrors. They don't really know what they're doing. So we've spent $200 billion into the economy, and we can see now that the fluid in the economy here is much fuller. We've used much more of the capacity. There's more currency, circulating, more industry, more commerce, higher wages, less private debt, much less tax. We'll talk about the tax in a minute. So less idle workforce, less unused resources, and the capacity is better used. So we see the tax that they've taken out is 30 billion. This is way less than it was before. So you might think, if the government doesn't need tax revenue to spend, what are taxes used for? Well, they're used for a few things, really. To have a government provide for the people, you must have tax. You must have something that binds the people and the government or the state together. So there must be a want or a need for the sovereign dollar. So this is why people go out and work, because they have an obligation by law that they have to pay tax. Just how much they pay is up to the government. It doesn't need it for revenue. Other uses for tax so that you can control behaviour. Smokes, for instance, or alcohol, or and also if all the money is ending up in Google's pockets, well, then you can tax them high. So now, with a capacity-driven system, tax and capacity constraints control the economy, not interest rates. Tax is not required for government spending. So now, the difference between the $200 billion spent into the economy and the $30 billion taken out, we now have a much bigger deficit, $170 billion. And you might be thinking, well, how do we service that? Well, it's not, first of all, it's not borrowed. It's just the record of the difference between how much is spent in, 200 billion, and how much is taken out. It's 170 billion. The 170 billion is the public sector's surplus. Sorry, the private sector's surplus. It's in the economy. It's not out here as a loan. It's in there, and the people are using it. It's buzzing around in the economy. The government deficit is actually an investment in the people. So hopefully that is an explanation of the capacity-driven money system that works. And there's many other ways of looking at it on the internet, on YouTube, by Googling MMT. You should be able to watch lots of videos. Okay, we're nearing the end. A couple of slides showing how the economy is operating now, looking at it through the macroeconomic lens. So firstly, we have the faucet here where the government is issuing currency, and they control how much currency they're issuing by opening and closing the tap here, right? And we can see in this picture here that the government aren't issuing enough currency into the economy, and so the economy is low and slow. It's way bottoming out here. They've got the tax tap, or the sink, opened right up. So as fast as the money goes in, it comes out the tax. Now, one of the things that this illustrates here is obviously the tax comes through this drain here. The drain is not connected to the tap, as it isn't in a household. Things wouldn't work very well if that's how it worked. And it doesn't work that way in the economy. The tax is taken out, and it is just taken out of the economy. It goes nowhere. Okay, so how do we fix this? I mean, looking at this picture here is actually what's going on in our economy. So what we need to do is we need to open up the faucet, and we need to close the sink a little. I really needed another slide between a nearly empty economy and a nearly full one, because obviously the goal is to keep the economy up, or the economy bubbling away, the fluid bubbling away near the top, not overflowing. But in this graphic, it clearly shows that the tap here is wide open, and the sink is closed. There's no taxing, either no taxing or not enough taxing going on. So what happens is the economy overflows, and in this graphic it states that that could result in inflation. Although in practice that doesn't seem to happen, because if we look at the American economy, for instance, they spend a massive amount more into the economy than they drain out. But they suffer from low inflation and low interest rates. And if we think of somebody who does that a whole lot more than even the US, that's Japan. They have a massive difference between how much they put in and how much they take out. And again, they're struggling with low inflation and low interest rates as well. So it doesn't appear to happen in practice. And I think if I just close with this this worry, if you like, about inflation, and we quickly talk about, I can hear it coming through the cameras, what about Zimbabwe and what about Venezuela? Well, if we just look at Zimbabwe first, well, and we compare it with New Zealand. New Zealand has a wonderfully diverse economy with agriculture, manufacturing, tourism, and it's all happening and very diverse. In Zimbabwe, they didn't have a diverse economy. Practically all their GDP came from farms. They were the fruit bowl of Africa. They were really high productive agricultural farms run by very skilled people. But unfortunately, they had a revolution, and Robert Mugabe decided that the land they were using for farming had been obtained illegally or wrongly, and I'm not going to comment about that. But so this revolution, during this revolution, they turfed the productive farmers off their land, and he awarded the farms to the freedom fighters, who had no idea about farming. And so, because they didn't have a diverse economy, the economy collapsed and resulted in hyperinflation. Nothing to buy. When you have nothing to buy and lots of money, the value is all upset. Venezuela, a similar but slightly different scenario. Venezuela was also did not have a diverse economy. Very little tourism, very little manufacturing. They did bugger all, actually. They were very rich because they had oil. They, I think it's 98% of their GDP was oil. They tied their currency to the US dollar, and then there was an oil crash. And once that happened, they had nothing else left in their economy. And again, nothing to buy. Lots of money issued by the government resulted in high hyperinflation. So those things are not issues with diverse economies, and don't need to worry about that in New Zealand. So there we have it. There was a reasonably quick look at economics. Hopefully I've delivered that in a way that people can understand that we're not experimenting with our economy. We're doing nothing more than deficit spending. And so based on the fact that we don't need tax for revenue, we have a list of some of our policies here. We will unleash our productiveness, creating a prosperous economy once more. So we'll amend the Public Finance Act, remove the requirement to balance the books, and we'll replace what the limited money supply system they have now with a capacity-based monetary supply system. This is a much easier way to forecast what you need in the country. For instance, if you know you're going to need a lot of roads in 10 years, you can adjust what you're teaching your schools. You can produce people who are going to be good for infrastructure. So much easier way to manage your economy. So we'll introduce a government guaranteed job scheme based on 35k per annum. By the way, that's tax free. Although the goal in this capacity monetary supply system is full utilisation of labour, and I think we'll get there fairly quickly, there needs to be something for the people that fall through the cracks. We're not going to have an unemployment scheme. That won't happen. The local will organise a system where local bodies take on people and find constructive things to do in their own region. So the first 35k of wage and salary earners, this include businesses, is tax-free. So immediately you'll have, on the average wage, I haven't calculated it properly, but it's about 10 or 15k extra in your pockets. We'll reduce the tax rate on wage and salaries to a flat 20%, up to 250k per annum. The tax rate above 250k will be 40%, pretty much how it is now. We'll reduce the corporate tax rate to a flat 20%, so this will make our businesses much more profitable with overseas people. We might as well do everything that we can to increase their competitiveness against the rest of the world. We'll abolish GST. There is no requirement for a goods and service tax. All it is a revenue gather for the government, and removing money from people and businesses. Well, not so much businesses because they can claim it back, but people. It'll be abolished. Minimum wage in the private sector, $20 per hour. So we need to just be careful that we balance the hourly rates in the private sector with the public sector, so to make sure that the private sector is always a better place for people than the government. Free healthcare for pensioners and children. This is a major difference to what we do now. My father died of bowel cancer, mainly because he was a pensioner and couldn't afford to go to the doctors. Developed bowel cancer and died a horrible death, like thousands of other people, because we have a government who cannot manage an economy. Pensions will be also 35k tax-free, so pensioners will be much better off and able to contribute to the economy much more than they do now. So that's a snapshot of some of the policies that we have. These are major differences to other political parties, and they are well thought out with experienced economists, progressive economists backing all around the world. So thank you very much for listening. I've been Andy Oakley, and this is the One New Zealand Party.